This is your next to the last unit. Oh, sorry, there's two more after this. Chapter 18, European and American Art, 1840 to 1910. And it's rather long. Normally it covers two class periods, but I've divided this into four separate sections um, just because those were convenient breaks. So some of these sections are going to be a little on the short side. So um, I'm sure you're fine with that. So here's your map. And we're going to start off by looking at some architecture. And this is in Paris. This is a building designed in the middle of the 19th century. Look at the dates on this, by Charles Garnier. Um, he, he planned the Paris Opera in 1861 to be a central point in the redesign of Paris under Napoleon III in the 1850s. This design won a competition, although it resembled no particular historical style. In fact, it is a reversion to an older style, which is Baroque, so it kind of has Baroque flavor to it. But iron was used internally. So you don't see the iron, but it's there as a structural element. So instead of just being a pile of rocks like the Baroque buildings were, this one actually has a skeleton of steel, or iron, sorry. It is a monument to pleasure. So this was an opera house. This is where the wealthy could go and show off their dresses and enjoy entertainment, a very expensive entertainment. So let's look at this. I have several slides. I have some bonus feature slides. So this is a map of Paris, and you can see how there are some very straight streets and some hubs, like up in the very upper part of the photograph on the back. It looks like the hub of a wheel with spokes coming out from it. This was all part of the grand redesign in the 19th century of the city of Paris. And there are several hubs going around the city. The one that you see there is the Arc de Triomphe. And down in the lower map, I found the place where the opera house is. So it's not really quite so obvious there that it is a hub, but it had several streets leading to it, and it was an important point. So this is the interior of the opera house. Oh, before we go to the interior, I should say something about the exterior. So I said that it is kind of looking like it is Baroque. So we've got columns used on the facade, but not used in a traditional classical way. So we saw this in Rome when Borromini did his little church. I said, oh, look, he's using columns. And then on the ground floor, we have arches. So we've also seen that in the Baroque period at Versailles, where we saw columns on the first floor, that is not the ground level, and arches on the bottom. And then if you look at the top, you can see a lot of decorative elements, some sculptures, some big gold figures up there. So it's got that sort of Baroque flavor to it, but it's not really that Baroque. So now this is the interior, and it also looks extremely Baroque. So this tendency of architects and designers in the 19th century to look back in history and to revive an older style is called Historicism. And it was not just the Baroque period that was revived, but there's a lot of neoclassical, obviously, but also neo-Gothic architecture, and that is really common in some churches built in the 19th century and also in universities, because there's a visual association of Gothic architecture with the old universities of Europe, like Oxford and Cambridge. So that was sort of something that people wanted to associate with. So now let's look at the interior. And as you're looking at these interiors of the opera house, I want you to imagine coming down that staircase, these Parisian people dressed in these very elaborate, very expensive gowns and tuxedos, coming down from an intermission in the opera, coming down to get a glass of champagne or whatever. And if this interior looks like something I've shown you before, and maybe it's Versailles, that's for a good reason. I think it's very, very similar. So here's the Hall of Mirrors that we saw at Versailles 200 years earlier. So when I say that Garnier and other designers are looking back and reviving old styles, this is pretty obvious right here that he's looking at that grand Baroque style that catered to the very wealthy, the aristocrats. Another thing I like to point out in this interior on the right is that there are these statues over here on the banisters on the stair rail. And it is a figure of a woman lounging on the handrail holding up a chandelier. And that is like these statues that were at Versailles that were figures holding up chandeliers that were actual functional chandeliers. So that's, to me, that's just super obvious that there's an attempt here to emulate this past glory. So new building techniques included cast iron, wrought iron, and steel that created skeletal structures. So this is a very important time in architecture as structures change materials completely. However, iron frame buildings have a fatal susceptibility to fire. Steel is lighter and stronger than iron and makes taller buildings possible. So you notice, I hope that all those things are in red, and that means that there's going to be some question about the new material on the quiz. And here is sort of the hallmark or the big poster boy for the new material. This is, of course, the Eiffel Tower. It's called the Eiffel Tower because it was designed by Gustave Eiffel. It was built in Paris in 1887 for the exposition in Paris celebrating the centennial, that is 100-year anniversary since the French Revolution. So that will also be a quiz question. So I expect you to know that this was built for that anniversary. It was part of a huge World's Fair, and Eiffel designed the structure to be made of steel, his new material. It stands on 4 legs, and then the whole structure tapers upward into this giant tower. I've got a whole bunch of information here about this. So at the time it was built, it was the world's tallest structure. It was 984 feet tall. The skirt at the bottom, that's what they call the structure with the 4 legs down there, conceals horizontal iron girders that support the weight of the tower. And this man, Gustave Eiffel, also designed the armature that's inside the Statue of Liberty, because it was about the same time that France gave this statue to the United States as a gift. So now this photograph, I really like this because it shows the original state of it. It was part of this exposition down here in Paris that was like a giant World's Fair that they put on to celebrate the revolution 100 years earlier. At the time this went up, people hated it because they expected, and their taste was for buildings like the Opera House I just showed you. They loved that sort of opulence, that look of the grand old style that reminded them of the good old days when there was some real class in the world. And then this thing came up, and they said things like, well, when is it going to be finished? It just looks like a skeleton. It's not even done. And when will this thing come down? They could not wait for the end of the fair so that the Eiffel Tower would be removed. They thought it was an eyesore, that it was hideous. Get rid of this. Well, I don't need to tell you that it never was removed, that it remains to this day to be sort of the landmark of Paris. It is the must-see spot for anybody who goes there. And of course, Parisians have come around and they now love their Eiffel Tower. So there it is. So this is just one example of architecture changing radically. Here's an American who also had a great role to play in the revolution of architecture. This is Louis Sullivan. He was the first, what we would call, modern architect. He despised historicism. He despised that look of the Paris Opera, absolutely hated that. He saw no point in making something look 200 years old. He combined ornament with vertical form and light-filled and well-ventilated light wells or atrium structures. So just look at this building. It's got a decorative element, a frieze across the top. I hope you can see that. This is one of the very first, what's called a skyscraper, so a building that goes up very high. Several stories here, but you can also see that there's some surface decoration here underneath the windows, but there's a regular pattern of windows and supports. And then the ground floor down here, which would have street level businesses, is designed completely differently. Now, as you're looking at this, you have to think, well, wait a minute, like with this and the Eiffel Tower, that's a lot of stairs to climb. Well, that's because also a great invention of the 19th century was the elevator. So you're not going to see it, but it's present, or you would not have a building going up this high. Nobody would have been walking up all those floors to go to work or to go to an apartment. So elevators were invented, and the first elevator to be used in a building was 1868 to 71, and this, of course, enabled greater verticality. And then the first electric elevator was in 1889. And FYI, an authority on elevators is teaching in the architecture department right on this campus. I know. So many talented people on this campus. Now, we're going to look at a little bit of painting and see what's going on in that world. So this is a painting by Jérôme, who's one of David's students. I hope you remember David. We saw him last time. I tried to impress upon you what a significant guy he was. So this is one of his students, Jérôme. And this is the style of painting that we're not going to see much of. Instead, we're now going to sort of depart from the mainstream of art and really focus on the avant-garde, or the people who are experimenting, who are pushing boundaries. And we will do that for the most part until the end of the semester. But this was mainstream taste. It's called academic style because it reflects the taste and the choices of the French Academy of Painting. So we have some carryovers here from the Romantic period. You can see that this is some exotic locale where there are people who are clearly not Parisian, dressed in non-European costumes, sitting around in front of a tiled surface that looks very much like a mosque, or what we saw in the Islamic chapter. And this little nude boy standing there holding up a snake. What is the story here? Well, it's exotic. It's extremely exotic. It's also very well painted. But like I say, I'll show you one more example of an academic painting later, but for the most part, we're going to leave this and see what else is happening. This is a somewhat of an academic sculpture, and this is Harriet Hosmer. She was an American sculptor. I always find it kind of amazing that women decide to carve these big hunks of stone. I mean, it seems to me like it's something that would appeal to a real strong man, but there's several women who become marble sculptors. So Harriet Hosmer went to Rome. She produced major exhibition pieces such as this one, Zenobia in Chains. So look at the form of her, and everything about her makes her look like a Greek woman or a Roman woman. She's the material is marble. She's wearing this long gown. She's standing contrapposto. So here it is, very neoclassical in form, but the subject is very romantic. The figure, and these are not my words now, I'm just reading a quote from the book. It says the figure is too proud to exhibit passion of any kind, and she embodies an ideal of womanhood defying Victorian conventions. So the Victorian period was pretty repressive for women in general, um, and that's what the chains are all about. So Zenobian chains. This is a painting by an artist who's in this group of English artists called Pre-raphaelites that I find visually very appealing. I like their stuff a lot, but it doesn't really fit into any of these general art movements. They sort of created their own little culture, this group of Englishmen. Um, so in England, artists looked to the art of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance for beauty, naturalism, and moralizing spirituality they thought was lacking in contemporary art. In this painting, this woman illustrates a story from Dante's Purgatory. So he was a medieval author. And it's rich with symbolism, implying that La Pia, the woman in it, is a captive within her marriage. I didn't say that. I'm just quoting again. So they're called Pre-Raphaelites because they believed that beginning with Raphael, that artist in the Italian Renaissance, beginning with him and that time period, artists had used many tricks, various visual devices to create their paintings. And in essence, they thought the artists were being manipulative and false. And they wanted to restore painting to its purest form, which is just showing exactly what you see with all details. There's no misdirection. There's no hiding things in shadows. So this is Pre-Raphaelite. And also their subjects tend to focus a lot on medieval, like the Arthurian romance, King Arthur, Guinevere, stories like that, and sometimes Bible stories, and in this case, Dante. So their group in England had another association with some other thinkers, writers, artists, designers. So there was a large circle, actually, of these people, and William Morris was one of them, and Philip Webb another. So William Morris is responsible for sort of single-handedly coming up with this craftsman style. We call it craftsman style in America, but they didn't call it that in England. But his idea was that people's homes should be full of beautiful handmade objects, not machine-made, not factory-made, but everything should have a love of materials and design. So he designed wallpaper, furniture. Philip Webb was another designer, designed furniture and architecture. And their circles in the, were very influential in England. The issue was, though, that this aesthetic was very expensive. So it meant that only the very wealthy people could afford William Morris work. So kind of sad. But the influence is very wide because they also influenced American architecture and American design as well. Now, here's an artist that I think doesn't really fall into any movement either, but he's one of my favorites, so I like to show him and talk about him and include several bonus features here. So this is an American, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, and look at the date. I just want you to note that because we will be going back and forth in the 19th century to sort of follow ideas. And this painting is roughly contemporaneous with French Impressionists, which we will see later in another part. But for right now, we're jumping ahead and looking at him. So he is sort of like I think the thematic inheritor of Turner's aesthetic. So Turner did that snowstorm in the Alps, and then you get Whistler, who's also trying to paint things that are very amorphous. They don't have a body. They don't have, and his desire is for his paintings to be just a pure aesthetic experience, to not illustrate anything, to not move you emotionally, but just to have your senses filled by looking at these, just for them to be very aesthetically pleasing and beautiful. His idea was to satisfy the elite taste for pure beauty. Nocturne in black and gold here, the falling rocket, depicts a fireworks show with several observers in the foreground. So I think at first glance it looked like an abstract painting, but then as your brain starts to sort it out, you can see a line across here where there seems to be reflection, like something above and something reflected on water, possibly a shoreline down here with these figures. When this went on exhibit in a salon, the main critic of the day wrote a review and said that it was unfinished, that it was an insult to the public. It was like flinging paint in the viewer's face. The critic's name was Ruskin, John Ruskin. So his criticism was so harsh that Whistler turned around and sued him for defamation of character. So there was a trial based on this painting, and Whistler ended up winning. But the judge awarded Whistler £1 in damages, and so he ended up being bankrupt because his legal costs were just so much more than £1. So it's really very sad. But anyway, so that's the story of James Abbott McNeill Whistler. So I'll show you some more of his work. So this is why I like him. He doesn't really go overboard in making everything completely crystal clear, but he does attempt to represent what one could see at this point. So I see this as like an island across a body of water, because again, I see reflections. I see this form of this tower reflected down here. I really love that. But this is what he's known for, I'd say, the most, and these are his interior paintings, paintings of women. He was experimenting a lot with compositions, and that's really what he's about. He's not about depicting an old woman in profile of his mother, but he was about composing this with these forms of lights and darks and making a good composition. I'm going to talk more about composition a little later, so I hope you're ready for some art lingo. So at the end of the 19th century, there's an aesthetic movement that involves design and some painting, some applied art. I think I'd call it that. It's called Art Nouveau. Literally, the name means the new art. And the Art Nouveau movement grew out of the arts and crafts movement and rejected the values of modern industrial society. So that's where society had been going, is to machine-made, factory-made stuff like, IKEA. So there's reactions against that, which is William Morris and Art Nouveau. This was in an area of applied design where beautiful objects could be mass-produced, but they wouldn't look mass-produced, and usually using plant forms. So Victor Orta here designed the Tassel House with graceful and attenuated curvilinear design. So this is just a landing in a building, and you can see all these curves, and even like this post that somehow looks like it might be a plant or a tree growing branches. Lots of viney things around. So this is the Art Nouveau aesthetic. And here is a building that kind of fits in with this. This actually predates the Orta house that I just showed you, the Tassel house. This is an Antoni Gaudí. He was a Spanish designer. He designed a lot of buildings in Barcelona, Spain, and this is Casa Batlló, and it draws on Islamic, Gothic, and Baroque traditions. The facade is a dreamlike fantasy of sandstone sculpture and multicolored glass mosaic. Its roof resembles a recumbent dragon with iridescent scales. So I love this. But look at the undulating surface here and all of this decoration on the surface, even the little balconies. Everything here has sort of an organic shape. And I love the roof line and this line here, this curved line, this little turret. I think this reminds me of something you might see in Disneyland. But look at the dates of this. This is like crazy stuff. This is how most Americans associate with Art Nouveau. And this is a Tiffany lamp. So Tiffany was an American jewelry company or silver company in New York City, and one of the sons of the original Tiffany was Louis Comfort Tiffany, and he started designing stained glass lamps that resembled plant forms. So the base of the lamp looks like the stem of a wisteria plant, and then the whole shade up here is made to look like the flowers of the wisteria. So this is Art Nouveau. Early photography. So let's look at this. To me, this is the most important change in 20th century art. So there's a lot of change going on, but to me, this one is dramatic. So the camera oscura was an early device for recording images from life. Photography was developed as a way to make permanent visual impressions. Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre was the first to fix a photographic image. A silver-coated metal plate treated with iodine fumes could make images visible when treated with mercury vapor. Sounds also very toxic. So many people were working on this. And this is a flashback, a reminder that I showed you this, although it doesn't seem like very many people watched my slideshow. But this was the device used by Vermeer in the 17th century, the camera oscura. And in that case, the back panel where the image was projected was just a sheet of frosted glass. So the goal was to be able to freeze that, to do something chemically so you wouldn't have to just draw it. So that's what photography is all about. So here's a camera, and it shows a lens here. The light rays bouncing off of the little house go through the lens. They get reversed on the back wall, and instead of being now frosted glass, this is some light-sensitive material, or film, or in the case of daguerreotype, it was a glass plate. So it's early photography. So here's one of the very first photographs that was made by Daguerre. And it's just a still life, meaning a collection of objects that have been placed there. And he had his camera with a treated glass plate inside of a dark box. He opened the lens. He exposed this for probably several minutes and then treated it. So this was his invention, coming up with this. So that's why the early photographs are called daguerreotypes, because of his invention. Let's see. So here, this photographer also marked an advancement in photography, because in the case of daguerreotypes, there's only one photograph. It's the very piece of glass that had been in the camera. So the next goal was to make a negative so that you could make multiple prints from it. And so this man, Talbot, or Fox Talbot, invented this with a calotype negative. So he did a simple exposure of a doorway with this old broom in front of it. So it's kind of picturesque, but it's basically a still life too. So that's the advance of that. So now, how does this change art? Well, in many ways. One of the jobs of art up until this point was, or painting, I can say, painting, was to record the appearance of things. So if you wanted a portrait of your wife or your husband, you would have to pay an artist or a painter to come paint it. But now you could go to a photographer's studio and have a photograph made. So it helps record the appearance of things, of places, of objects, and records history. I'm going to show you some of that too. Also, artists can begin to use this as a tool. So if you want to do a painting of, say, a king who is very busy and doesn't want to sit for hours, you could paint from a photograph. So many applications. And here's one of the applications here. Alexander Gardner did some documentary photography during the Civil War in the United States. And he went to the battlefields and took actual photographs of actual dead. So this was a real soldier who died in the Civil War. However, he did the 19th century version of photoshopping, so he sort of fudged reality. He moved the body into this place between these rocks and this little man-made barricade here. He moved in there to make a more interesting photograph, so he composed it artificially. But it is real rocks and a real dead person with a real gun. Julia Margaret Cameron is, I believe she's English, and she mainly photographed well-known people of the day, so I don't have any idea who Thomas Carlyle is. But here's a guy you know. So this is Abraham Lincoln. So from the advent of photography onwards, we have photographs of every single president. They've all been photographed, so we know exactly what they looked like. You can see Abe here before and after the beard. Looks very young on the left, I think. And then here's a painted portrait. I believe this is the portrait of President Lincoln that is in the National Portrait Gallery. And now we're at the end of part 1. So I wanted to get you through photography, and I will pick this up at this point in part 2.